Good afternoon, everyone. I am Elise Ferrante. But before we begin our session today about using nonsense screeners in Upper L, I just wanted to thank the We Shall Read for this awesome summer literacy series. And if you haven't checked out their website, make sure you do so for some other upcoming free sessions within the next week or two. A little bit about me. This is my 16th year teaching. I've taught in both private and public school, everything from kinder all the way to sixth grade, plus ESL and reading resource. So a wide variety of ranges there, which I think kind of gives me a unique perspective to see both ends of the spectrum of down in kindergarten teaching kids, their foundational skills all the way up until middle school, where they're applying all of that in such a different way. But today we're going to focus on upper elementary and how do we really help those struggling kids in upper L without really kind of making them feel like they're reading baby books or that they're being singled out when most of their peers and classmates are reading books similar to the ones on the left, and they might be getting books that look like the ones on the right. So we want to make sure that we can still give them access to the text and to content and grade level curriculum, but in a way that they are able to access it on their own. And to do that, we have to meet them where they are at. So a little bit of background about me as an elementary student. I was a great reader, loved reading from the time that I was really young, but I was a terrible speller. I would sit at the kitchen counter every night and my mom would grill me on spelling words and I'd get upset because I could never spell those spelling words. And I just was not able to make that connection between decoding and reading words to applying it in my own spelling and my own writing. And I've seen that disconnect with a lot of my students in fourth and fifth grade over the past couple of years. And knowing how I struggled with it, I wanted to be able to fix it for them, but I didn't know how. So enter into brain friendly reading, right? So first we get into COVID and then, we're just all trying to survive, come back face to face. And this is our first year fully back face to face. So we're really excited about that. But in my fourth grade class, I had 6 students who were reading on a first grade level, or below a first grade level, I should say, in September. The good thing was that there was a group of them and I could put them together and they didn't feel alone or they didn't feel isolated. But again, they're reading on a first grade level when everyone else is able to read the content of the fourth grade curriculum. So I wanted to really help those kids make some growth. I was using Words Their Way for a spelling program. I thought I was doing the kids justice by doing that. I thought that it was giving them what they needed on the level that they were at. I was able to make spelling groups based on the Words Their Way assessment. And then once I put them into those groups, I could work with the kids who were, high achieving on words that were on their level, and then I could work with my struggling kids on what they needed. So I thought I was doing right by them by doing that and not just giving like one spelling list for everybody. So I was doing all that. We finally got into a routine with our spelling program, with our groups, with reading groups. Everything was going great. And I had to take an extended leave. So when I came back from my leave in January, our district had adopted brain friendly reading. They had already started going through the trainings. My substitute teacher was already introducing that to the students. And I was feeling super overwhelmed. Like, this is just one more thing I don't know how to do. Like, can we just go back to how it was? So it was not something that I was super excited about. So I come back and Kristen comes in right away and she's like, well, I'm just going to model this lesson in your class. So I was like, great, because I have no idea what I'm doing. So she came in and I was really excited to see that the kids knew what they were doing. They were tapping the charts. They were able to find the patterns, identify the words. They were writing. They were playing the games. They had taken ownership of it in such a way that it made me feel less nervous. And that helped me as I started learning more about the science of reading. And it kind of became like that missing piece. Like, okay, well, we know how to teach reading, we know how to teach this, but when we get all those pieces together, that really kind of solidified that that was that missing piece. That was that link that I wanted to help my kids with, that I needed help with personally when I was their age. And so kind of all just fell into place. Um, every time I learned something new, I was really excited to share it with my kids. Um, and of course, you know, they're kids and they were like, wow, our teacher didn't even know this. I was like, no, because they didn't teach it to us this way. And if they did, I wouldn't have spent all those nights crying at the kitchen table about my spelling words if I had known these things when I was your age. So I was just really excited to share everything with them. So we're going to kind of talk today about how, now that we've got a little bit of background about where we're at, we're going to talk today about how to use the screeners in Upper L. I decided to use the nonsense screener because I felt like by the time our kids get to Upper L, if they were seeing things like this one, tad, fog, let, they're able to decode those, and they've seen those words so many times that it might be more automatic than really are they applying the rule or are they applying the skill. So that's why I chose to use this one, the nonsense screener, because I wanted to see if they could apply the rule to unfamiliar words, because that's really what we're trying to get them to do, is to be able to read independently words that they're not familiar with, right? When I see it in a text or when they see it in a book, we want them to be able to decode those words on their own, or when they're trying to write, you know, words, spelling words, or just in stories, in their writing, in class every day, we want them to be able to write the way that they speak. And I had noticed that a lot of my students, when they're writing, would use smaller, simpler words. They'd want to use a word and then they're like, oh, I don't know how to spell that one, so I'm just going to put this instead. So all that to say, that's why I chose to use the nonsense screener. I wanted to see if they could apply these skills and these phonics rules to words that were obviously not real words, but to words that they were unfamiliar with. So I was a little bit apprehensive at first when I first started doing it, because I was like, okay, well, I'm going to do this and then what, right? Like, what am I going to do with all this after I did it? But by the time I did like my first 3 students with my high kids, because I wanted to feel a little bit more confident before I got down to the kids that really needed it. And after doing just 3 of my higher kids, I was like, wow, you have a lot of deficits that I didn't notice by doing other assessments with you, because it didn't naturally come up. So I finished the rest of the class. The nonsense screener took between 3 and 5 minutes per kid, depending on where their frustration level was. So I finished them all within a couple of days. And then what I did was I created this spreadsheet, and I shared this with you. It's in the drive, in the link. So I created a spreadsheet that went with 80% mastery of each of those skills on the screener. And you can see that I like separated it. We had the vowels, the short vowels, magic E, etc. And I went with 80% mastery because I felt like you can get 80% of these nonsense words, they understand the rule and they're ready for the next thing. After I created the spreadsheet, I filled it out with my students' names and their data. And anyone who scored below an 80%, I highlighted. And then I was able to use that data to figure out where our starting point was. At a quick glance, after doing it for the first time in January, I saw that 64% of my 4th graders did not have mastery of vowel sounds. And vowel sounds is something that we don't really teach in Upper L. You know, like that's something that they talk about in kindergarten and 1st grade, and they do nursery rhymes and they sing songs about what each letter says. And it wasn't something that I was like, how do I teach you a vowel sound when you're 10 and 11 years old? It's something that usually you come to me knowing. So knowing that 64% of my kids were still struggling with that, it was like, okay, we have to go back to the basics. We obviously have to go back to the beginning. And then after that, moved on to Magic E, which I had 52% of my students that did not master words with Magic E, which is a lot of 4th graders and it was really interesting because at the same time that I'm struggling with this, I saw colleagues in first grade doing the same lessons that I was doing. And I was like, okay, so they've gotten it every year, but then we had a pandemic and they might not have gotten it for a couple of years. So we really had to go back to the basics and fill in those gaps. Because if they can't read those words, they're not going to be able to read these 3 and 4 syllable words in our science and social studies textbooks. So this data gave me a starting point. And here you can see some of the things that we did as a whole class. We were tapping our charts every day. I had students come up to the board to do that and to lead that. Our charts at our seats. We also tapped our charts with our book buddies in lower L. So there was a lot of chart tapping. There was a lot of writing. You can see some of the students writing the words on their desks or identifying vowel consonant patterns to break apart syllables. You can see a Go Fish game going on there, and then some students putting together sentences to try to make sense of the word patterns that we were working on. So that was kind of how I would structure my whole group lessons. We would start with the chart tapping, do some word writing, and then play a game. At the same time, I was using that data from the previous chart to create my intervention groups or my RTI groups. I knew that those kids needed some extra help on some basic skills that maybe the rest of the class did not really need me to keep going over. So that's kind of how I structured those groups also. By the following month, after just 1 month of doing this in February, I saw the number for Magic E drop from 52% to 27%. So we went from 13 students not knowing or reading words with Magic E to only 7. So I was able to then put those 7 kids in like an intervention group and keep going over that skill while the rest of us had moved on. Some things that we just talked about a little bit in my small, we would do the same thing, but it was more explicit instruction about whatever skill we were working on. For example, Magic E, we'd keep reviewing it and playing games. And then I'd send those same games that we play in class, I'd send them home with my students so that they could keep practicing that same skill at home just for some extra support. I did have a couple students that I did one-on-one support just throughout the year, and it wasn't always the same kids and it wasn't always on the same topic. It was just like, hey, I noticed that you were struggling with, and we do 3 or 4 days in a row of just one-on-one 5 minutes at a time to do that extra support. And then playing our games with partners or playing them with our reading buddies or playing them at home. And the kids had access to the games at all times too. So if they wanted to, if they had some downtime in between something or they finished something early, then they knew where they were and they could go and pick those up to keep going. So every month I would take that screener, and this is just some snapshots from my binder. So you can see I have January, February, and March here. I would make a new spreadsheet for each month. The January one, that's the one on the very left. See all of the things that are highlighted there. Those are skills that the students did not master 80% or higher. So you're seeing a lot of yellow, a lot of highlighted on the January. But then if you look over at the very right, where we get to March, there's not a lot of left. We really worked really hard, but we were able to master so many of these skills just by doing the chart tapping, just by doing the games, just by having that explicit phonics instruction, which I'm going to be honest with you, as an upper L teacher, I've never taught phonics before. Like I taught it when I taught kindergarten, sure. When I taught second grade, sure. But in upper L, like we expect the kids to come to us with this baseline. And when they don't, those are the kids that fall through the cracks. And looking at my data from January, when I first came back from my leave and seeing all of those kids that were falling through the cracks, I was like, well, we have to change what we're doing. I obviously need to teach this. They are not coming to us knowing it. And they left knowing it. So you can see all of the growth there. So each month I'd record it on a new spreadsheet, and you do have links to those also in the drive to those spreadsheets. So like the neater spreadsheets that are typed up, not these handwritten ones. So I organized, yeah.
When you did those screeners monthly, were you only checking the kids who had not met the mastery?
Yes. Thank you, Christy. I was only going back to kids who had, if they were highlighted, I would just go back to them and go over those they were missing. I didn't see the point in going back to someone who had already passed everything. Like, you obviously know how to decode those, so we're not going to waste our time and effort there. So yeah, I was only going back to the kids, and I was only doing those skills that were below 80% mastery.
And when you did your intervention groups, were your intervention groups during reading or writing time?
So I use the daily 5 model for my literacy block. Um, so I guess you could say both, since in daily 5 they do get that choice between what they want to work on each round. I would make them do certain rounds, and then like some were mandatory. For example, you had to do reading and you had to do writing every day. Listening or partner reading, those were optional. And not, when I say optional, I don't mean optional, but if I was meeting with you, then that's one that you would cross off or that you wouldn't complete for that day. So I think that, yes, during both.
Thank you.
Of course. Here is how I organized everything and how I set it up. I had a binder, and I had the page of the screener that the students saw. That was in a sheet protector, that's right here. And that's what I would give to them. Then you can kind of see the, oops, there we go. You can kind of see the difference between the one that I'm recording on, where it has the grades, like how many they got out of each section. So that's the one that I was recording on. And then I had the next section of the binder had my monthly spreadsheets, and then each kid had their own tab that after each assessment, I would just file theirs into that section. So let's talk about the growth that we saw, though, because we want to see the data, right? We want to see that it worked, that we had some success here. And you can look at the 2 spreadsheets here. The first one was from January and the second one is from April. So just over the course of 4 months, again, the yellow highlights are kids who were below that 80% mastery mark. And you're able to really see, like, we went from having a lot of struggles over to, all right, we're doing pretty good here. So I kind of broke this chart down into how it's organized on the Phonics Screener. Consonants, even consonants. I still had 2 kids in January who didn't know all of the consonant sounds. I had 8 kids that did, or only 8 kids, sorry, that knew the vowel sounds. That's 18 that don't know the vowel sounds. That was really shocking. So as I was able to look at this, able to identify, like, okay, we're obviously starting with vowels, and then it looks like then we need to jump to magic E, and then we really need to focus on some 2-syllable words here. And so I was really able to target in on those skills where the deficits were and what they were missing. By the time we got to April, we had made a lot of growth. Most of us had mastered the Phonics Screener. I think I just had 2 or 3 students who were just really stuck on 1 or 2 skills, but most of us had mastered it and we were able to move on. One thing that I really loved about doing it this way is that everybody was doing the same thing. Everybody was doing the nonsense screener. Everybody was chart tapping. It didn't matter what reading level you were on. It didn't matter, where you were at, but everyone was doing it. And it did help my high kids because those were the ones who were struggling with their spelling and their writing. And it helped my struggling kids because now they were able to read words and access content that they weren't able to before. So we want to talk about spelling, right? In Upper L, we want those grades. We want to give them tests. We want to know where they're at. So like I said, I was using the Words Their Way assessment. It's the BEARS assessment for spelling. And you can give it a couple times a year. So in September, I gave that. And as I said, I used the Words Their Way program in the fall. Then we switched. But I still wanted to give that assessment again in June, just to look at the growth and to say, hey, did this help them? Did we really make some growth here? And you're able to see, obviously, based on the data, that yes, we grew. We grew a lot, and they were able to spell words that they didn't before. They were able to identify patterns in words that we'd never thought about before, and they were able to kind of put those skills and all of that foundation that we had been laying into practice through this assessment. So super proud of them for that.
Elise,
Yes.
I'm sorry, can you go back to that?
Okay.
Just in case somebody isn't familiar with that, can you explain what 1 in digraphs means versus 0 in digraphs?
Yes.
Thank you.
Of course. Sorry. So here I had one kid who was still with the digraphs word, which I believe is ship, because that's like the second one on the list. And then here we had 0 kids. Everybody had gotten that by June. Same thing with blends. We had 3 kids struggling, but in June, hey, we all got that. And then we saw that again drop. And what I think is interesting though about words their way in the Bears assessment versus the nonsense screener is in the words their way Bears assessment. When it says long vowels, that's more talking about like vowel team, like an AI for train, which was not present on the phonics screener. But even though it wasn't there, and even though it wasn't focused on, they still made a lot of growth there just by doing those chart tapping activities, just by having that instruction on the different sounds from our charts. So we still did make growth there too. And then we grew a lot on our NWA too. We had 22 out of our 26 kids make their goal this year. And we use BAS, it's like our DRA reading level assessment, and 22 out of my 26 kids made 1 or more years worth of growth. And to talk about here, those 6 kids that I was talking about in the fall who were reading on a 1st grade level, they left reading on a 3rd grade level or above. So like they made close to 2 years worth of growth or more. So just by giving them that explicit phonics instruction that they were missing really filled in those gaps that they had. And you don't have to just take my word for it, because here's what some 4th graders had to say. I'm not going to read them all to you, but a lot of them talked about how it helped with their writing, it helped them with their reading, they were able to put their sounds together. And I do have an interesting story here, because one of them mentions how she can do the arm spell, something that we talked about in brain friendly reading, and that they would use to break words apart when writing or decoding. And she was pulled by another teacher for some testing and some assessment, and was trying to tap the word out. And the teacher who had pulled her is only familiar with secondary students and did not understand, like, what's all this about? What is this kid doing? And came back and was asking about it. And she was like, oh, that's awesome. And that made me really proud as a teacher too, to be like, well, she internalized that just when I tell her to do it, but she knew, I don't know how to read that word, but I have a strategy that can help me, and I'm going to do that. So super proud of her for that. And obviously she wrote about how it's really helped her so much. And that kind of takes us back to the end. Were there any other questions that anyone had?
When you did the phonics screener, did you were your small groups based on like, oh, were you pulling those kids, like these kids need magic E, or was it just like you did reading level like groups? How did you do those small groups?
Yeah, so my small groups for phonics, for that, not related to my reading groups or anything, was just based on those skills that they needed. So they were very fluid, and like you might be in this group for 2 weeks and next week you're out and someone else is in. So it was very fluid. It wasn't very, I don't want to say it wasn't very structured, but it really wasn't, like it wasn't solidified. So, and it was also very short when I would pull those intervention groups, just 5 to 10 minutes of like, hey, remember Magic E? Let's do some word work with some Magic E. All right, you guys are done. Hey, do you guys remember about R? Let's talk about what R does when it's with an A or when it's with an E. So, super targeted, super quick, super short, but also very fluid.
Okay, and then so you had those like phonics groups and you had reading groups too going on at this, like you were doing both.
Yes. So I met with just one, and it's different because they're older and they're reading like chapter books and stuff, but I'd meet with one reading group a day, and then 2 to 3 phonics groups a day, depending on our
Okay,
time.
perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Elise, one of the other questions, and I think when you showed the picture, it kind of answered it. Every time you did the phonics screener, you didn't use a different form, did you? The kids look off the one and you marked on the same one?
No. So let me stop sharing and I can kind of show you this way. Hold on one second. So here's my binder. Okay. So the kids have this one that's like in a sheet protector that I would give to them. But then the one that I'm writing on, it looks different. It has the like how many they're getting right out of each section on it. So it looks more like that. And then I would use a new one of these each time I assessed a kiddo. And then I would just file it into like their section of the binder. So they might have 3 or 4, 5 or 6, depending. Some kids only had one because they like knocked it out of the park the first try, but some kids got a new one every month because they were still working on different skills.
Okay, thank you. Sometimes I use different color pens and
Yeah,
just use
yeah.
the same one, but that's, someone asked that question.
And I wanted to share too, let me go back to my, so here is the what's in your drive or what's in the drive link. And you'll see that there's the nonsense screener and then the other one's just labeled phonics screener. So this one you might be more interested in for lower owl, new ESL kiddos, special ed kiddos that you know that they might not be ready for nonsense words, but you do want to see if they can master those. And it is 2 pages. So this is the page that the kids would get. And then this is the one that you're scoring on where it has this, you know, the side part for the scores. But then the nonsense one, this is the one that the kids would get. Obviously the words are nonsense. And then if you keep scrolling, that's the page that you're marking on. And like Christy said, you could use the same form and just put a little key up there. Black is for September and blue is for December, or whatever you want to do. And also in there are those spreadsheets. And so it has the 80% up there at the top. So for example, there's 21 consonants. The kids need to get 17. If they only got 15, then you would highlight them or do code you want to do to signify that didn't meet that 80% for those words. So,
you know, Elise, one of the things that I love about what you said is that this isn't our fault, but it is our problem. And you really embrace that and made it your problem and came up with a solution.
Well, and I'm sure that you've all heard that phrase before, like in lower L, kids learn to read, and in upper L, kids read to learn, but they can't read to learn if they can't read. So if they can't access that content that we want them to read, then they're really not learning much. So I really wanted to fill in those gaps because I felt like they're going to go on to middle school real soon, and we don't want them to fall through the cracks.
We also offer a 30-hour training. It's a asynchronous class. It's through an app now, or you can do it on the computer, but it's through its own program. It's all laid out there on the We Shall Read website. I believe there's a way to get a discount code for that. So it's very comprehensive. All of the things you were talking about, the chart tapping, the arm spelling, the background knowledge on science of reading. It's all there. It's the how to teach reading, that kind of what we learned this year in our district, but a little more comprehensive even.
And I think like the kids really took ownership of it, at least in my class this year, and especially coming in after they had already started it, I was like, oh, you guys know what you're doing. I'm the only one that doesn't know what I'm doing. So really jumping in and just getting your feet wet and trying it and seeing what works.